Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our NAHRO webinar today on Canada's National Housing Strategy, some lessons for American policymakers. My name is Jeff Manoir. I am the chair of the International Research and Global Exchanges Committee for NAHRO National, and I'm pleased to be sharing the virtual stage today with two of Canada's leaders in housing execution and research. Mr. Ray Sullivan is the executive director for the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association and a longtime housing practitioner. He's joining us from Ottawa, Ontario. And Mr. Steve Pomeroy, he's the industry professor with the Canadian Housing Evidence Collaborative at McMaster University in Hamilton, but he also resides in Ottawa, Ontario. And Steve was also the recipient of last year's National Association of Housing and Renewal Officials International Award. So pleased to have him coming back to talk to us a bit more and following up on a presentation that he gave in Orlando at the NAHRO National Conference, talking about the national housing strategy in Canada. Bit of housekeeping today. We've got a Q&A session. The feature is at the bottom of your screen. If you've got a question you'd like asked, we're going to pick those up at the end of the session. And we'd also like to ask everybody to stick around to the very end, if you can, to please complete the survey so we can take this feedback in and incorporate it into future sessions. So we started this dialogue, as I mentioned, back in Orlando last fall, talking about the journey of Canada's national housing strategy, which really was formulated not that long ago. Back in 2017, it became law. And we realized a lot of things were right, but a lot of opportunities came from that. And Steve spent about half an hour talking to us at that session about the journey, about the experience. And we realized very quickly that there was so much more we needed to uncover. So we're pleased today to dig into this in more detail over the next hour and look at some of these things and hopefully some lessons learned that we can bring back to ourselves here in America as we advocate for a national housing strategy for our nation and try and move things forward. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Steve, who will lead the first part of the presentation.
Thanks, Jeff. And well, I'd say happy to see you, but I can't see anybody. And you can't see me, so I better turn my camera on here. There we go. Okay, so yes, as Jeff indicated, we'll talk a bit about how we came about developing national housing strategy, what it tried to do, how we've been doing on it, where we've gone to in the last essentially now eight years, and finally be bold to not so much to tell you what to do, but to say here's some things that you might take away from this in terms of how you translate and interpret our experience into what you want to do in the US context. So in terms of our context and comparisons with the US, of course, we're both federations. And so there's a division of powers between the federal government and, in your case, states, in our case, provinces and territories. In the Canadian system, our constitution, the word housing doesn't actually exist, but it's generally jurisprudence has interpreted this as a provincial jurisdiction. That said, in the early days of housing policy development in Canada, it was very much centralized to our federal government and our housing agency here, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which would be somewhat analogous to HUD, except that it doesn't have the urban bits. It was really more focused on housing and mortgages. There was a very active federal role, although it did ebb and flow with involvement of the provinces initially, like in the US with public housing, and subsequently with the federal government taking on a stronger role until 1993. Where our federal government actually terminated all funding for new social housing development at that point in time. I'll come back to where we were at in terms of the size of the stock at that point. And then There was a period, sort of a void of about 8 years from 94 to 2002. And then there was a re-engagement, but at a very modest, much smaller scale than we had had in prior to 1994. And there was ongoing advocacy to since expand that, go back to the kind of volumes we'd had in earlier years, and to re-engage the federal government, which was something that was pursued through the development of the National Housing Strategy. And then currently, we've had a bit of a change at the federal level, with the responsibility for housing policy being taken out of the CMHC agency and moved over to a ministry, the Ministry of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, HICC, or Housing Infrastructure Communities Canada, which happened 2 years ago, with a minister in there. And so in that respect, we've actually evolved now to be a little bit more like HUD, in that we have, urban issues are now integrated with housing in the way they are in the US, which I think is actually a better partnership of policy areas than perhaps existed with just having housing as its own silo. So in terms of where we're at, as I mentioned, we started off just like the US did. Our initial forays into this area were in the form of public housing. So this was, but in the Canadian case, what our legislation allowed, the federal government really didn't want to get into the business of owning and operating a low-income or public housing in the early post-war period. The legislation was enabling, and it allowed municipalities or provinces that wished to produce public housing to actually ask the federal government for assistance. So our public housing, about 200,000 units, built essentially between 1964. There was some starting in 49, but only about 12,000 units. The big public housing push really started in 64, so a bit later than yours in the US, and did about 200,000 units between 64 and 75. Which represents around about a third of our total stock. And that was all delivered through provincial housing agencies, housing corporations, the stock owned and operated by provincial organizations. So it's somewhat like your public housing authorities, but ours were provincially owned rather than locally owned. Subsequently, in the mid-1970s, at the time when you had a moratorium on public housing under the Nixon administration, and you kind of pivoted away from public housing to below market rental housing, with creating a whole industry of affordable housing, private sector affordable housing developers. In the US, we didn't go the private route; we went the community route. And tried to nurture the growth of a community housing sector of nonprofits and cooperatives, which now represents about a third, or just over 400,000 units of our social housing stock. And we really don't have the same parallel private sector affordable housing industry that I think you would have in the US. Next slide. So what happened when the federal government terminated funding at the end of 1993, and then at that time, the programs that we did have in place were all cost shared with our provinces and were being funded by the federal government, but delivered at the provincial level on a cost sharing ratio of between 75 federal to 25 provincial in the smaller provinces, and 67-33 in the bigger provinces, because they chose to up their participation. When the federal government basically terminates funding in a cost-shared program, if you're funding at 30% or 33% in BC and Ontario's case, 33% of nothing is nothing. So when the federal government withdrew, so did all the provinces, with the exception of BC and Quebec, which continued on at a fairly small level, using only their own unilateral funding without the federal lion's share of the money. So we had a period there, as I mentioned, sort of the dark ages, a real void from 94 to 2003, when there was no new development. We started seeing the emergence of homelessness. Housing affordability issues were on the rise. We had, the media was identifying the growing homelessness as a national disaster issue in this press clipping from 1998, and some smart sort of social policy and housing advocates came up with the phrase that Canada is the only OECD country without a national housing strategy, the only G8 country, I guess, in this particular clipping. Which was completely untrue, as you well know. You didn't have one either, nor did anybody else. But as a very sharp politician once told me, don't let a the truth get in the way of a good 10-second soundbite, which is exactly what this was. And this became, an urban myth. It was accepted yes, as wisdom. Indeed, there was a private members bill brought to Parliament in around 2003, in which, in the preamble of the legislation, said, whereas Canada is the only country without a national housing strategy, which just proves how entrenched that idea had become. So it really did become the rallying call for developing a national housing strategy. But it took a lot of tenacity and a lot of perseverance, because we didn't get one for another 20 years until 2017. So when the government changed in 2015, we had a conservative government from 2006 to 2015. A new government was elected under the Liberal banner with Justin Trudeau. And some of the folks that were involved in actually writing the election platform at that time, had been involved in the community housing space, were advocates of affordable housing, and managed to put into the election platform that the federal government would sort of get back into the business in a much more significant way. And as we do here in Canada, following the election, the government being voted in, and the appointment of cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister's office issues mandate letters to the ministers to direct them in how to carry out their business. And the mandate letter to the Minister of Housing was to amongst other things, to re-engage the federal government in affordable housing. It didn't specifically say go and create a national housing strategy. It just used this more general phrase of going, invigorate our role and do something. This was therefore interpreted by the advocates and by the senior officials and by the political staff as being kind of a directive to go and pursue a national housing strategy, which is exactly what they started doing. Initiated a whole bunch of consultations over about an 18-month period from 2016 through to the end of 2017. I think and I'll come back to this at the end, but this consultation process was really more about asking people, what do you want to see in a national housing strategy? What issues are we dealing with, and how should we respond to them? It wasn't really premised on a very, very thorough analytical assessment of what is the nature of housing problems and what do we need to do about it, which I think I shall come back to, was one of the weaknesses. So we ultimately, with much fanfare, announced the National Housing Strategy in November of 2017, and it was heralded as the first ever National Housing Strategy, and that's the debatable point in terms of some of the documents that had existed before that may have been probably more comprehensive, but didn't have the word strategy in their title, and also the largest ever federal investment in affordable housing. And because the strategy was announced with a 10-year window, and a funding framework for over a 10-year period, which normally budgets here are in a 5-year fiscal window, it's obviously going to be bigger than anything we had before because it had such a long lifespan over it. So it was announced this 10-year, $40 billion commitment to housing. And that has subsequently, through additional annual changes and additional programs, additional funding in the subsequent years, is now actually at $115 billion. Now, having said that, that's not necessarily all real money. The announcement conflated three things. We had existing funding flowing to the previous social housing agreements that have been in place with 35 years of ongoing subsidy. Even though we terminated funding for new social housing in 93, those 35-year commitments were still in place. And the funding associated with them, about $1.9 billion, was still flowing. So they included that in the $40 billion. A large portion of the funding was not actually grants and contributions. It was in the form of loans, which in budgetary terms is non-budgetary expenditures for government. So, money the government borrows in the bond markets and basically gets it paid back in the form of mortgages. So it's not actually a budgetary expenditure. And there were a small amount. It was only about 12 billion of the 40 that was actually real money, real new money going into the system. Next slide, please. So in terms of what the strategy was trying to do, it set out sort of two overarching targets. One was to reduce a renter housing need by 50%, and I won't get into the technical details, but we have sort of a mechanism in Canada to assess housing need, which looks at levels of affordability, people paying more than 30% of their income, folks living in substandard housing in need of major repair, and folks living in housing that is deemed to be crowded based on the household composition and the number of people relative to the number of bedrooms. And that number was around about 1.15 million renter households in need. In the time when the strategy came out, we still only had data from the 2011 census that was based on that number, which was therefore 530,000 households removed from housing need. The other headline objective was to reduce chronic homelessness. The strategy initially targeted a 50% reduction in long-term chronic homelessness. So these would be folks who are living in the shelter system and or in absolute homelessness for more than 6 months. And that actually, there was a lot of criticism. Why would we only try to end that by half? Let's erase homelessness in totality. And so that actually was upgraded to 100% reduction in 2020. In concert with some new initiatives that were introduced to respond to homelessness, and the rhetoric at the time with COVID, of course, was distancing and living apart, and people living in shelters. Clearly, that wasn't possible. So there was a bigger commitment to creating more supportive housing at that point in time. Along with those two objectives, there were sort of three key areas. Recognizing we had built 600,000 homes over the essentially 40-year period from 64 to 94. It's a lot cheaper to preserve what you've already got, even $50,000 a door of retrofit compared to $300,000 or $400,000 of new capital required for new. So preserving what we've got was a very big part of the strategy. Adding to that, new stock by funding the building of new affordable housing was the second element. And then recognizing that for many folks who are facing affordability problems, those who are living in housing that is adequate and appropriate for their household size, we don't actually need to build them a new house. We just need to help them pay the rent. And so unlike the US, where you've had Section 8 vouchers, housing choice vouchers for many decades, we've never had a national housing allowance program. And I recognize yours is not universal like the UK housing benefit, but it's more rationed. And certainly ours is very rationed as well. It's not a universal benefit, but it did bring in a new element to help target folks who were either living in precarious situations of risk of becoming homeless as a result of losing their housing due to arrears or other reasons. And then on top of all that, because we had this history of the provinces actually delivering programs that were funded or co-funded by the federal government, the National Housing Strategy created two streams, continuing on to fund the provinces to bring in the funding for preserving existing homes, a little bit for some new and delivering what was called the Canada Housing Benefit, which is our version of a Section 8 voucher. Having said that, the vast majority of funding flowed through the federal side in terms of this whole re-engagement of the federal government. They went from basically doing nothing since 1994, or in fact really since 1986 when delivery was handed to the provinces. So they'd been very much on the sidelines for 30 years and tried to sort of really elevate their game, get back into it in a big way. But they lost all the capacity and expertise to do so, which I think, as I'll come back to later, was one of the weaknesses in the way the strategy rolled out. One of the very creative pieces that was heralded by many folks, both in Canada and internationally, was that the National Housing Strategy document, it opened up with a chapter talking about housing as a right. I know there are ongoing discussions. I can remember discussions down in the US at the Tri-Country Conference with Mike Stegman back in 2006, where this whole concept of embedding sort of housing as a right into legislation and how it is in fact possible or not to enforce a positive right. Nonetheless, in Canada, we did make that big step and said we're going to embed the concept of housing as a right in legislation. So the strategy itself preceded the development of the legislation, and which wasn't developed and implemented and passed until 2019 in the form of the National Housing Strategy Act. And that act created an obligation of the government, both the national government and subnational, so the provinces and territories, to proactively pursue a progressive realization of the right to affordable housing. So it's kind of a mouthy, mealy kind of way of saying, well, we're going to kind of commit to do something. We're not sure how much or how long or who we're going to help, but we're going to be here and do something. That's perhaps a little critical. I think it's a sincere intent to make it have some teeth. But as I say, because you're trying to enforce a positive right, and also by embedding it in legislation, you're tying the hands of a future government. That the legislation says you have to continue to progressively realize the right to adequate housing. You have to have programs, have funding in place that allow people to be helped. Now, this doesn't mean, as the quote here suggests, that there's an obligation that individual that is homeless has a right to be housed. It's an obligation on government to actually create and sustain programming over time. And as late as last December, when we thought the government was going to change, before your president managed to sway our election for us, there was a fear and a risk that a change in government, would this legislation still be held up by a change in government that may not have the same commitment to this issue? We have no idea where that would have gone, and since it turns out that Mark Carney came in and saved the day, so to speak, and won the election, we continue to have a Liberal government, although in a minority parliament, to continue on with that particular commitment. And as Ray will come back to later, housing was a very prominent issue in the recent election campaign, and there are pretty strong commitments in both the platform, and we now suspect next Monday, when King Charles will be here reading the speech from the throne, in terms of commitments to ongoing support for affordable housing and addressing homelessness as well. Next slide. So in terms of what we've achieved out of those big objectives of significant reductions in rental affordability need, significant reductions in homelessness, I would say probably not much. We have built a few homes. I mean, one of the problems, of course, with a program that's focused on building new, even you can make lots of announcements, which this government was very good at, or the previous government was very good at, but there were a lot of words lacking in actual doors being completed and people being housed. So there is a lag effect when you've got a supply-based solution. Many of the reports that came out tended to focus more on funding commitments that the government had approved funding for development or funding for various initiatives, but the actual construction and completion and occupancy of those units was still 2 or 3 years away. So patted themselves on the back a lot. But not necessarily with actual real concrete results. With 7 years on now, we are starting to see units that were being initiated in 2018. They are now completed and occupied. But again, it's a slow pipeline. This stuff coming out the other end is kind of like treacle. It takes a while to get there. And there is an ongoing monitoring process where there are quarterly updates on progress there are a whole stack of initiatives within the National Housing Strategy, and they do quarterly reporting on those. But again, it does tend to lean very much into here's how much money we've committed to spend, as opposed to being where we're at today. In terms of the implementation, I think the advocates, certainly the members of Ray's organization, were very, very pleased to see that we actually now had a strategy. One of the key concerns from the previous decade or 20 years of program that we had in place with being delivered through the provinces was that we would have sort of 3 years worth of funding that was going to expire on March 31st, and by the end of February, you still didn't know if it was going to be extended. So the on again, off again nature was a real irritant. And I think making a commitment to a 10-year funding program provided that predictability and consistency in funding, so you could go ahead and start planning, knowing the funding was going to be there when you got to the point of making an application. As I mentioned, because our federal agency, CMHC, had really gotten out of the business in the mid-1980s, they had 96 branch offices across the country, staffed with a lot of professionals, with a lot of expertise and local knowledge. when they transferred direct delivery responsibility to the provinces and territories in 1986, they closed all those offices. So they really lost their local presence. And so when they tried to re-engage in a big way, and most of the funding, I think it was something like 85%, 84% of the funding in the National Housing Strategy was being directed through unilateral federal programs, they really didn't have the feet on the ground. And I would argue what they should have done was ramped up the provincial spending to ramp up outputs and slowly built up the federal involvement over time and rebuilt their expertise that way. They essentially jumped in the deep end of the swimming pool, having never had any swimming lessons and without a life jacket, and really sort of struggled to keep their heads above water. And there was a lot of criticism, and Ray can speak to this a bit as well, from his members that were very, very frustrated in the way that these programs were being rolled out. And the other part I mentioned before was this sort of the conflating of loans, grants, and contributions. They wanted a big announcement, and the $40 billion announcement gave them that. But where the loans were there. And in addition to that, most of those loans, the vast majority now of what's now 115, almost 65 billion of it, more than half of it, are actually loans to private developers of market rental housing. Even though they tried to attach a label of affordable to that, it was proven to be not very affordable because the criteria they used was poorly designed. And as a consequence, despite the leaning into reducing rental affordability need, reducing homelessness, there's an inconsistency in the quantum of funding that was being provided against the objectives that had been set to do it. The one particularly positive aspect of the strategy was a funding, I think $64 million was allocated to a newly created by the sector agency, the Community Housing Transformation Center, which was really set up to strengthen, professionalize, and expand the non-market community housing sector of nonprofits and co-ops. And that is starting to have an impact. And the discourse today is very much around how do we actually significantly scale up the non-market sector, and how do we make sure that the new government, in developing programs as it now evolves, in fact, is doing things that will help us actually do that. As I mentioned, there was a very strong focus in the narrative of the National Housing Strategy on ending homelessness and reducing rental housing need. But it didn't really. It has been criticized by some academics and other observers and myself as not really being a comprehensive strategy. It was really a homeless and affordable housing strategy as opposed to a comprehensive housing strategy. And if you don't look at housing as a system, think if the price of home ownership is too high and young families can't move out of renting into home ownership, they're clogging up the rental market. They're leaving demand in the rental market, adding pressure to the rental market, which pushes up rents, and that reverberates down to the bottom end of the rental market, where they were really concerned about people losing their homes and becoming homeless. If you're not addressing upstream effects of what's happening in affordability generally in the rental market and access to home ownership, and you're only focused on the pointy bit of the housing system, you're really going to have these unintended consequences reverberating down through the system. So I think it didn't really do that, and it kind of missed the boat. In addition to the misallocation of funding relative to the objectives. I already mentioned the sort of the poorly designed affordability requirement and the very strong emphasis on new rental supply. We certainly did need new rental supply, but the way that particular initiative was rolled out and the degree to which it overwhelmed the funding for the more needy stuff was an issue. We have had some, obviously, issues of homelessness have continued to grow despite the goal of 50% or 100% reduction. We've gone in completely the other direction. Homelessness is much worse. We have encampments in many of our cities, and I think the characteristics of folks that are in those encampments today is much more historically. Homelessness, obviously, is long-term homelessness, has been associated with substance abuse and mental health concerns. Now it's increasingly folks simply can't find anywhere they can afford to live, and they're living in their car, they're living in a tent, and that's really created these growth of encampments, which has become a real big issue. And perhaps it is a big enough issue that, and it's attracted a lot of public concern because the parents think their kids can't play in the parks anymore because they're full of people in tents, that may catalyze public reaction and force government to actually do something about that. So in some respects, having a real crisis may actually engineer some meaningful government response, which we haven't really had to date, even though there was some minor tweaks during COVID. And as I mentioned before, the lack of federal expertise, really not using the provinces in the way we could have done, building on their expertise in parallel with growing the federal expertise. Next slide, please. So I'll flip over to Ray now. He can kind of tell you where we're now at and how things are progressing and what's going to happen with the new government.
That's my cue. Thank you, Steve. And Steve was widely consulted by the federal government in the development of the National Housing Strategy. I was fortunate enough to be around at the periphery as well. In fact, the nonprofit that I used to manage hosted the What We Heard report that came out in 2016, leading up to the strategy itself. And it was a big deal when the National Housing Strategy came out. As Steve said, the federal government was jumping back in with both feet after, mostly being absent from this space for 25 years. The idea of a 10-year commitment and that kind of long planning horizon. This is something we constantly struggle with, a development planning timeline and planning and construction timeline is often longer than the term of government. And we need funding commitments and stability that go beyond that normal 3 to 5 year cycle. These things were a big deal. There were a couple of things that I was disappointed in when it came out. One, it didn't clearly spell out the role for different orders of government. What's the role for the federal government? What's the role for provincial governments? What's the role for municipal governments? And we'll come back to the ways that has hurt the implementation of the strategy later on in the presentation too. Around the time that they were releasing the National Housing Strategy, we started seeing this graphic a lot. The federal government started using it, provincial governments, municipal governments started picking it up and using it as well. So one, it's not to scale, right? It over-represents in terms of the picture, the non-market side of the equation. But as someone who was operating affordable nonprofit housing, I was like, great, that's wonderful. But the strategy itself really had some blind spots in seeing how this connects into a single system. So there weren't a lot of measures, there weren't a lot of strategic initiatives that addressed the health of the market side and the ownership side of the housing system. And as Steve said, it is one interconnected system. So, reverberations, blockages that happen on one part of that system affect everything right down to the park bench on the far left. Now, I've been part of a number of people who've critiqued this so-called housing continuum as it spreads. Oftentimes it comes with an implication that people progress in some kind of linear fashion through that continuum. We know this is not the case. We know that there are multiple points along this line that are perfectly good places to live and enjoy a good life. And we also know that people go backwards and forward and backwards and forward again through this kind of continuum. Most of the policies, most of the objectives under the National Housing Strategy were really targeted toward that left-hand side, cutting in half the number of people who are homeless, cutting in half the number of people who are in core housing need. But as it started to roll out, what we started to see was most of the spending was actually aimed at the far right side, as Steve mentioned, at private market, private for-profit rental construction, providing low interest loans. It's effectively public subsidy to build stuff that arguably the market was going to be building on its own. And part of those gaps, as they became evident over the years after 2017, when the National Housing Strategy was released, we started to see during the 2019 election in government initiatives the years after, trying to patch and plug some of those holes with initiatives that were meant to shore up affordability on the ownership side of the market, that were meant to encourage more private supply. The government's intense focus at that time was supply, build. This is what we kept hearing. And we, as the association that represents nonprofit housing, kept saying, well, yes, but not any supply is going to do. It has to be the supply that is affordable to people who need it the most. Don't forget, everything from the purple left on this graphic that you yourselves brought in. So we started to see over a couple of years more initiatives, aimed at the market side of housing. Some of them stimulated demand and probably increased the cost of housing in a lot of cases. The pandemic was a big shock to the economy, to society around the world, and obviously no different in Canada. One of the positive outcomes, if there are any, was a specific program targeting, it's called the Rapid Housing Initiative, targeting supportive housing, so deeply affordable housing. It was actually 100% capital funded from the government, something we hadn't seen in decades. But they kind of expected that the provincial governments would kick up the operating dollar to provide the actual supports, the health and social services that would go along that. And they were just rolling the dice. There was no agreement, there was no actual coordination with provinces to do that. To make it even worse, that program, the only one that was targeting that left-hand side of that continuum with capital dollars to build deeply affordable supply, was done in a series of one-offs. There's Rapid Housing Initiative, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We never knew if there was another phase going to be coming in the next horizon. So, we advocated successfully to make that a permanent program, which the government did a couple of years ago. They did it at a lower funding level, but at least it's there on a long-term basis. And our hope is that provinces can then step up and invest the time to create a program to provide operating and support dollars that complements the capital from the federal government. I've talked about this already. Steve talked about this before, this idea that in 1867, when we were coming up with the Canadian Constitution, nobody thought about housing. So it's not mentioned in the Constitution. And it has been this orphan of our Confederation, certainly in the past couple of generations, with federal, provincial, and municipal governments each pointing the finger at each other, saying, that gap is your responsibility. You're the one who needs to step up first. 7 years after the National Housing Strategy comes out, our own Prime Minister, the Prime Minister who directed that the federal government should get back involved in nonprofit housing, comes out with a statement saying, well, it's not really a federal responsibility. Absolutely incredible. And he had just appointed a new Minister of Housing at the time. And that minister, good soldier that he was, went out and repeated the exact same message, that it's not really the federal government that should have the lead in housing affordability. So I decided to introduce myself to the new minister by writing an op-ed in a major newspaper telling him why he's wrong. And he was wrong. And luckily he eventually agreed with that. But this has become a repeated theme in housing policy in Canada. Flash forwards to April 2024. We have, is it a new national housing strategy? The government releases Canada's National Housing Plan. They're not calling it a new strategy. It leaves a lot of confusion for a lot of us about what happens to the old strategy and is this the new one to replace it? But it's still fundamentally based on this idea that we're going to build our way out of this. And in my view, an erroneous assumption that somehow oversupplying the market will bring prices down, but the market is not capable of oversupplying itself. And this is what we're seeing already in the country right now, as private market development is starting to slow down, even though we have the same levels of need, the same level of housing crisis. Steve mentioned in one of his slides that there was a reference or citation to the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer. They're an independent accounting arm of Parliament, and they evaluate government spending, projections, and those sorts of things. They came out with a report last December on the National Housing Strategy. And I tell you, I was reading it at my desk one morning and my jaw was dropping. So the National Housing Strategy had as a goal to reduce the number of households in core housing need by about, instead, we're seeing that number increase. And by way of reference, there's about 40 million people in Canada. We're just a little bit larger than the state of California in terms of size. The goal was to remove 530,000 households from housing need by 2027, 2028. And instead, we're seeing an increase of almost 1 million households for housing need. And what was even more incredible to me was they were assessing, well, what would have been that change if it wasn't for the national housing strategy? Because, the pandemic happened, a huge economic shock, a lot of things happened in that period of time. Can we attribute any of that change to the national housing strategy? They concluded that if it had not been for the national housing strategy, there'd be about 78,000 more households in core housing need by 2027. So a 3% impact from this $115 billion strategy. And why? Well, as Steve mentioned, the biggest envelope of spending supported for-profit rental housing. And the envelope of spending targeted toward people in core housing need, people who need affordability the most, actually declined by 19% for the 10 years before the national housing strategy and the 8 years so far of the national housing strategy. Steve talked about those legacy programs that built a lot of social housing in the 1970s, 1980s, and into the early 1990s, and the ongoing federal mortgage subsidies, and in some cases, operating subsidies that continued on a 35 or 50-year timeline. That envelope of spending was recycled into the national housing strategy, but it was no longer targeting people in deepest housing need. It was more allocated toward, middle income or even market rates for rental housing. So as Steve reminds me from time to time, good policy is not always the same thing as good politics. So here we are a couple of weeks ago with another new Minister of Housing, just after our federal election, Gregor Robertson, who's a former mayor of Vancouver, one of the cities that has been at the forefront of the affordability crisis and homelessness crisis in Canada. We cheered this. This is a good idea. Here's somebody who gets it. He's asked by a journalist last week, do home prices, ownership prices have to come down to address the housing crisis? And his answer is no, we need to focus on more supply, build more housing, let the government back into building affordable housing. I got a call from a different minister's office last year. They were in a bit of a panic when the condo market was dropping out in the city of Toronto, our largest city. What can we do to prop up the condo market? It's like, well, wait a minute. The condo market is dropping out because rents have leveled off. Rents have stopped rising at that double-digit pace that we've been seeing for the past several years. Why? Because of the policies that you've put in place. This is an intended outcome of the policies and programs that the federal government has put in place. So don't panic if that's actually working. Problem is, so much rental housing is supplied by that secondary condominium market, individual investors buying a condo, renting it out on the market for their own personal profit. That's a structural issue that we need to address. But affordability, flattening of rents, that is the intended outcome. And guess what? It means like people like me who bought a home 23 years ago are going to lose some of that paper value that has accrued through no effort of our own in the value of our home. That's what affordability means. It's a really difficult political question. As this shift is starting to happen, as we're seeing a new government in Canada come in, starting to see signs that heavy emphasis on just supply is lessening a little bit. And there's a little bit more recognition that it's about the right supply and the right kind of affordable supply. I came across this chart a little while ago online. Thought it would be interesting to sort of compare. This is about home ownership, not about rental, but I suspect there could be a similar line if we were to look at rental rates, looking at levels of affordability compared to disposable income over the past couple of decades. The obvious thing that we can see in there is that things were reasonably aligned between Canada and the US until the 2008-2009 mortgage crisis. Thank you very much for that, by the way. That saw a lot of the bubble burst in the US and a lot of other countries in the world. different financial and different banking system. In fact, at the time, steered by our now Prime Minister, Mark Carney, when he was Governor of Bank of Canada. At that time, we weathered it a lot better than other countries did, but we never got a chance to let some of that pressure out from our housing market. So we just kept building and building and building, where other countries, other OECD and G7 countries had sort of started to flatline at a lower plateau. The pandemic, as I said, a big shock to ours and many other systems. A lot of that pressure got let out. And then we had super low interest rates, and that stimulated demand again, and housing prices started climbing yet again. We're now in a little bit of a post-recovery, I guess, from that situation. Interest rates are down. Things are starting to level off. And we're starting to see a little bit of a change from our new government. So we just had an election at the end of April. Mark Carney, our new Prime Minister, who was the Governor of the Bank of Canada in 2008, 2009, has put a couple of interesting things on the table. And it's going to take a few months before we know really what it is, but some things that we're concerned about right now. So remember how great it was to have that 10-year window on the national housing strategy, that we could plan, in 5, 6, 7-year increments, matching the timeline of new construction of housing. Well, we're approaching 2027, 2028, when a lot of those programs start to end. The main program that targets new nonprofit housing is the Affordable Housing Fund. We're actually starting to hear from some of our members that they're hearing feedback from Canada Mortgage and Housing Company, the program administrator, that money is drying up. There was a big burst of applications just before the election. They're not projecting that they're going to have more money to lend and to grant after, well, very soon from now. Steve talked about the importance of those bilateral agreements, the federal and provincial bilateral agreements, as a major delivery mechanism for a lot of important programs, housing allowances, capital dollars in the national housing strategy. Those also are coming to an end in 27, 28. So it really is a time to refresh our thinking. An interesting proposal came out from the Liberal Party of Canada during the election, that they would create a new Crown corporation called Build Canada Homes, under what presumably is going to be a different kind of approach, specifically targeting affordability, specifically trying to shift the construction sector toward a much greater proportion of modular and prefabricated housing, being able to access surplus, or what my colleague Carolyn Weitzman calls lazy land. I live here in Ottawa, in the national capital. There's a lot of government office towers with acres of mowed grass around them. I just imagine all of the townhomes and apartments that we could build around those. Making that kind of government land available for housing development, making a new refreshed allocation, we expect, in low interest loans and grants for affordability as well. I wanted to highlight a couple of things that are a little bit different in terms of thinking compared to 2017 when the National Housing Strategy came out. So one, I think there's a greater acknowledgement of the link between the housing market, the rental land ownership housing market, particularly the rental market, and the number of temporary visa holders that we have in Canada. In the pandemic, shortly after the pandemic, there was a workforce shortage, particularly at the low end of the wage spectrum. We welcomed a lot of temporary foreign workers into the country. They are exclusively renters. They saturated the rental market. At the same time that's happening, something that had been building up for a couple of years before the pandemic, a lot of Canadian universities were losing parts of their public funding. They were welcoming more international students for whom they charged the full cost and more of tuition. So as a revenue generating strategy, as much as everything else, those international students, exclusively renters. So we were seeing, in particularly university towns, a complete saturation of the rental market, private market landlords driving those rents up, and a rapid spike in rents. There's a greater awareness of the connection between those objectives and housing objectives with the government right now. I think there's a greater awareness of that interconnectedness of the so-called housing continuum, that they do need to take a systems level approach. Speaking with a government person just a couple of days ago who was saying, yeah, there's a whole package of things that are targeted at different income levels in the housing market, from trying to reduce development charges at the municipal level, from trying to reduce construction costs to directly supporting non-market community housing. And of course, this is all going on in the context of President Trump, which has really launched a major threat to Canada's economy through tariffs, threats of tariffs, threats to our sovereignty and independence as a country. So there's a real desire to have a made in Canada industrial strategy that uses our own resources along the supply chain to create that housing. But one of the things that's still very much there is that cloudiness, that lack of clarity between the different roles and the appropriate roles between the federal, provincial, territorial as well, and municipal governments. This is going to be an interesting thing to watch play out over the next couple of months as the new government gets its feet underneath it. Steve published a great paper a little while ago. The government, when launching this Build Canada Homes initiative, or sorry, in the campaign, when Mark Carney, as a candidate, launched this Build Canada Homes, he talked about learning from history, about that wartime response to building housing after the Second World War, about the historic roles of the federal government before. And Steve pointed out that you need to learn from history, but you need to learn select from the right part of history. So I'm gonna pass it off to Steve to comment a little bit on this one.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah. The point here simply was, we did have a lot of a layering of government programs in the 1970s. We see there's quite a significant growth in the row and apartment starts, which were in the 70s were still predominantly rental. Condo development hadn't really come into the system yet, and we had some very advantageous tax break programs, direct assistance to rental development, the ongoing public housing program, and the emergence of the non-profit housing programs. And we really did see peak levels of housing construction in that period related to the government actually significantly funding those kind of programs, as opposed to what all the references are. We need to go to a wartime construction kind of initiative. Sure, we built a bunch of houses for returning veterans in the late 40s, but in the scale of that development, they were basically building bungalows in suburbia for returning veterans, and the scale of development was a quarter of what it had ultimately became in the 1970s, which I think is a much better part of history to think about. And why did we achieve that, and how can we replicate that kind of outcome versus just building a bunch of small bungalows as we did in the post-war period? I think that probably takes us to the sort of as we finish things up here. Next slide there, Ray. We're just sort of throwing out what we've learned from this and what we think might be useful. I think the US, you actually have the privilege of a very, very extensive range of research institutions, university-based independent think tanks, much more so than when we do in Canada. As Ray might suggest, there's me and a couple of others. You have a whole pile of housing research folks down there. And so I think, where we, as I mentioned before, I don't think we really did our homework on articulating and carefully diagnosing the nature of the housing problem as we were developing the National Housing Strategy. I think you have the opportunity to do that, and drawing on those resources, I think, could really be helpful. I think, as I mentioned, it's not just about, as much as we are, and particularly the raised members in particular of the non-profit affordable housing sector, they are more concerned about the pointy end, the homelessness, the deep affordability issues. But having said that, I think Ray's already acknowledged, this notion that we do need to think about how the overall system works, and let's make sure we're doing things to create a healthy housing system, and then within that segment the kind of policies and initiatives and programs to address access to homeownership, a viable and affordable rental market, and do things that prevent people from falling into homelessness and get them out of homelessness quickly. So we need to be kind of thinking across all of those. And I think if you're thinking of a strategy, you need to have all those elements in there. I don't know that this exists to the same extent in the US, but with the critique I made about, really overlooking the roles of the provinces, the capacities that they had, and the fact that they have some money. I mean, when the federal government essentially sidelined the provinces and gave them a tiny little bit of money on a cost shared basis, well, I think, the $4 million of the 40 that went to the provinces only levered 4 million of provincial spending. If they'd ramped up the provincial spending, they would have ramped up the provincial roles. They would have also ramped up provincial spending and got more money in there. I think there's a question in the Q&A sort of relating to that. That absolutely, the federal investments and federal commitments can lever parallel investments at the subnational level, in our case provinces, in your case states. If you are going to set up some objectives, then you need to make sure you design your programs to align with those objectives. Obviously, as we've spoken about, ours didn't. They leaned very much into, let's get a big number, let's do this in loans, and let's direct those loans to the private sector, which had nothing to do with the two headline objectives of ending homelessness and reducing renter affordability. When this came out, I recall a discussion with the minister at the time, and they said, we recognize that this is our first attempt at sort of developing a strategy. We're going to make some mistakes, and we're quite prepared to react and adjust. When it actually came to time to react and adjust, and when critics like me went to the senior officials and said, look, guys, you really kind of got this wrong, the stock answer I would get, and this happened half a dozen times, was, well, we can't change that now because Cabinet approved it that way. I said, well, Cabinet only approved it that way because you actually recommended it that way. So go back, do a mea culpa, tell them you messed up, and ask for a change, which, senior bureaucrats just weren't prepared to do. So I think there does have to be a commitment that you're not going to get everything right. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the possible. And try a few things, get them wrong, but then create the capacity to change things afterwards. And then in terms of the reporting, as much as this has been a very politicized process in Canada because it was brought in by a government that really wanted to re-engage and show political commitment to the issue, which was a great thing to have. But they've been somewhat opaque and very much less than transparent in reporting on the outcomes of what's actually being achieved. And I think, again, we're in a much different situation where I think in the US, HUD makes data sets available to you guys for researchers to do really deep analysis and promote the public policy discourse. We don't have access to the same kind of data sets. They're very, very difficult to get. You have to do access of information requests to get data on what's the outcomes of all these loans to private developers been, that kind of stuff. You've got a data set on low-income housing tax credits. You've got a whole bunch of data sets on mortgage discrimination type stuff. And so I think, sustaining and expanding that transparency to ensure that you do get, good, constructive, critical analysis, which does actually go to the second to last point. It helps you to refine and adjust what you've done. So those were the things I would draw out of what we've done. I don't know if Ray has anything else that you might want to add there, Ray.
Yeah, and I think, 8 years on, we've had some lessons from the National Housing Strategy in Canada. I think there's a new government, a new prime minister, there's a new outlook on how we need to tackle these things. And dare I say, we could be heading toward National Housing Strategy 2.0, and I think there's a lot of lessons that we can build in to improve this. The important thing that we need to hold on to is that long-term commitment and that predictability that allows us to create more affordable housing altogether. I don't know if we left a ton of time questions, Jeff. Sorry if we were rattling on a little bit more, but there's some good ones in the Q&A if we have some time to get to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. It's really insightful, and I don't know if we can stick around a couple extra minutes or if we'll get thrown aside. But I'll try and thread a couple of these together as we go. Back in '86, you guys spoke to. I think it was at the time referred to devolution, or at least that's how it was phrased to me back in the 2010s when I got first involved in housing. Devolution from the federal down to the provinces, and then we saw some of the provinces like Ontario further devolve down to the local municipalities. If we look at the Trump administration's proposed budget and where that push seems to be of, hey, the federal government isn't necessarily as heavily involved in housing provision as they have been. Do we think there's some success that can be found within I guess, block granting, handing the money to the provinces or to local municipalities, and would that help address any of the lost resources that we saw? The housing experts in regional offices, we're already seeing the attacks happening on HUD staff, reduced numbers there, and certainly the threat of losing almost 43% of our Section 8 voucher money. It's staggering. What are your guys' thoughts on if America was to devolve?
Right. I mean, and part of the answer, I mean, again, context is always important, and you can't just cherry pick things that have happened in one country and move them to another country. We have a far more decentralized constitution and set of responsibilities than I think you would in the US. So I mean, that's that could be a bit of a barrier to what you're talking about there, Jeff. I mean, and the concept of block grants like CBDG and other block grants that you guys have had, we typically haven't used block grants to the same way you've done. There are some transfers in the areas of health and social programs. The Canada Health and Social Transfer, for example, is a more of a block grant type one. But in the housing space, we haven't really had it. We've tended to have cost shared initiatives. And now the initial cost shared initiatives that came out as part of devolution in 1986 were enticing the provinces to come back in with a fairly small fee. You cost share only 25%, we'll still pay 75%, and we'll keep our level as it is. And the more if you go to 33 or 40%, that'll add on top, and we'll have more resources come into it. So I think this idea of strategically investing to lever partnerships has worked, and I think could work again in the future. The points I think Ray was making about the Rapid Housing Initiative and a number of other initiatives, actually, the National Housing Strategy, as much as the document talked about an extensive consultation process and working collaboratively with the provinces, it really wasn't. And there were a number of 11th hour announcements where literally 11 o'clock the night before an announcement, the Deputy Minister would get a call in the province saying, by the way, we're doing this tomorrow. I hope you're going to come along for the ride. The Rapid Housing Initiative, the provinces are really struggling to deal with the homeless issue in the cities, in their provinces, and they're the ones that are funding the health and community services, the wraparound services. Sitting down and having a constructive conversation and say, look, guys, we both want to solve this problem. What can we do together? Let's design a joint initiative, jointly funded, and announce it together, rather than basically whacking you over the head and say, look, you're going to have to come to the party because we just anteed up the capital. So I think this notion of more collaborative federalism, cooperative federalism, as opposed to competitive federalism, which has really been the downfall, I think, of the Trudeau years, the last decade.
Yeah, and I come back to that initial disappointment I had in seeing the original National Housing Strategy that didn't spell out those roles for each order of government. And the federal superpower in this is finance. The federal government can borrow and lend money at rates lower than any provincial or municipal government can. Back in October, November, I, like everyone else in the country, was 100% certain we were going to end up with a conservative government that would have taken a very different approach to affordable housing after the election. And I had a lot of conversations with conservative policy advisors, sort of trying to underscore, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're less interested in direct federal delivery of programs, fine, but don't lose that lending power, that low cost finance power that only the federal government has to that extent, even if you can do more delivery through the provinces and coordination with other orders of government.
Great. Just really quickly before we move on to the next question, Stephen's going to put out the poll. So anybody that needs to jump off, thank you. Appreciate you taking the time to answer the poll. But we've probably got about 13 more minutes we can keep rolling for if that works for anybody willing and able to stick around. I know it was posted in there. There's a question about social housing, public housing, probably a phraseology that's disappearing from the Canadian dialect. More of a move towards community housing, more palatable, I think, to some than others. Do we think, and maybe it's too early to tell, in the new Carney Liberal government, do we think there's going to be an appetite to invest in community housing? Or is community housing going to be left to continue to fend for itself as we are seeing some great leadership in organizations across Canada? We got to do this on our own. We're going to build on our own. Or do we think there's going to be a continued reliance on, the co-ops and nonprofits and faith-based organizations are going to figure this out on their own?
So when Mark Carney was running for the leadership of the Liberal Party, he repeated something that we've been advocating for a long time, which is setting as a target that we need to double the share of community housing amongst the housing stock as a whole. His former minister repeated the same goal during the campaign. But I'll tell you the challenge that we face. I think that government policymakers would like to move in that direction, but I think they're worried about the capacity of the non-market community housing sector to deliver on that. Like in a lot of jurisdictions, we have a small number of large, very high capacity organizations and a very big number of super small organizations operating at, less than 150 units. And the answer they give them is, well, A, let's work with the organizations that do have the capacity, but B, create the mechanisms that let us build that capacity and build that scale so that we can be that delivery partner for you. You can subsidize the private market to get affordability, but then you're subsidizing profit, or you can subsidize the non-market community housing sector and you get affordability long-term, even after the government money has gone away.
And the comparison, I mean, the term community housing is kind of a bit of a misnomer in many respects, Jeff, in that, originally it was supposed to refer to co-ops and non-profits, but we had a system in Canada where municipalities could create a housing subsidiary and a housing corporation, and we called these public non-profits as opposed to the private non-profits, which were the ones like the community-based organizations, truly. And then you had big organizations like Toronto Community Housing with 58,000 units, rebranding itself to get away from the stigma of public housing as Toronto Community Housing. Well, so a lot of what is labeled community housing is still public housing, so comparable to your public housing authorities. So the dissimilarities are not as distinct as they appear to be because of the way we've labeled things.
So we got another question here around data sets. And Steve, you mentioned that HUD provides data. I think unfortunately what we're seeing is a trend where HUD they've already taken away some of that data, and rest of it is either offline completely or is at risk of disappearing and becoming harder to get access to. Has thought started to percolate? And I know you gave a presentation at the CHRA Congress just was that last week or the week before? Now it's a blur, up in Saskatoon, about data and the importance of data. Is there any asks we should be putting out there now and seeds we should be planting on how to make data collection and data availability a key issue?
Yeah, that's a tricky one in the sense, I mean, I suspect the senior officials at HUD are very sympathetic. And if you ask them, they would say, yeah, we'd love to provide data. Unfortunately, you have a political leadership there that's disinterested and going in the opposite direction. And I don't have any solutions for that one.
Understand. Let's see, try and make sure I'm not missing anything as I scroll through here. Apologies, got to catch up on my reading here. There's a question here about income thresholds and the 30% income threshold, which I think is kind of universal. And even as we look at the UK and down in Australia, New Zealand, out of the 3,000 PHAs that we have, there's 140 or just under that are moving to work agencies, and they have some waivers to loosen the rules. Has Canada looked at any of those types of programs of deregulated, at risk of using that, housing programs?
Because we've got a variety of programs that have come at the federal level, provincial level, they have used RGI in the past, but we're not regulated the same way that your PHAs are by HUD. So there's greater flexibilities, and essentially what we've seen since the re-engagement initially in 2002 in the investments in affordable housing are a bunch of programs that were sort of branded as affordable housing as opposed to social housing. Social housing, there were ongoing subsidies with rent geared to income rents because the subsidy, one of the problems with rent geared to income system is that, and the consequence of that problem is that you charge extremely low rents. You don't have any revenues. You can't even keep the lights on, let alone maintain the buildings well, which is why you have crappy public housing buildings, if I can be so blunt. If you want to actually be a good asset manager and maintain the asset well, you shouldn't be charging really, really low rents. You should charge realistic rents like they do in the UK, and then stack some kind of allowance like the housing benefit in the UK or Section 8 vouchers in the US to more specifically target the affordability problem. And I think that's what some of your moving to work MTW agencies have done. I think they're one of the pioneering ones. San Diego, basically asked HUD to terminate the public housing subsidies and replace it with Section 8 vouchers because it was more generous. So I think you have to be careful. I mean, as much as we want to help low income folks, low income is an income problem. Trying to solve an income problem with a housing solution is a very expensive solution.
That's a good way
I'm
to.
a fan of, I'm a big fan of rent guarantee income. And in the province of Quebec, it's actually 25% of income, not 30. And they're jealously defending that. But governments have to fund that subsidy. And there are no governments that are really interested in funding rent guarantee income subsidies anymore. It's a long-term and variable budget commitment, essentially a liability for them on their books. So we're seeing a lot more upfront capital subsidies in exchange for making the product more affordable, but it takes a lot of upfront capital to make it deeply affordable. And as Steve was in part alluding to, there are like 5 different definitions of affordability under federal government programs right now. And municipalities and provinces also have different definitions of affordability. And to make these projects work, our members have to stack those programs on top of each other. And they hope that there's a Venn diagram that overlaps somewhere in the middle that gives you an affordability target, sometimes a little bit too restrictive.
Yeah, 80% of a Toronto rent right now is not affordable to anyone.
No, and there should be one income-based measure of affordability that applies across the board.
Yeah, understood. So a number of us from NAHRO, I think there's going to be close to 20 of us, are actually headed over to Dublin in a couple weeks' time to the International Social Housing Festival. And one of the models we're hoping to pick up and learn about and report back to the members on is the cost rent model. And I don't know if that's started to resonate around Canada either, where you take the cost of operating, maintaining, and capital needs of a building, divide it by the number of units, that's rent. And I think that takes the pressure off. Government doesn't have to find new money. It's the rent. But it doesn't get more nonprofit than that, really.
That's what we did in the late 1960s, early 1970s. That was our programs were essentially cost rent programs. What then happened, of course, is with inflation in costs, the costs got ahead. The break-even rent no longer was affordable. That's when we initially stacked rent supplements and subsequently wrapped the rent ongoing subsidy into the future program. Great if it works, but when you've got a misbalance between lower incomes and costs, you still have a gap, an affordability gap.
Yeah,
and
that can spread quickly.
Yeah, the nonprofit that I used to manage, our first 12 properties were under that break-even rent kind of model. And what we started to discover is that the building across the street was charging lower rent than our break-even rent. So it wasn't providing that kind of affordability. But more importantly, a break-even rent did not properly factor in the capital replacement needs over a long time horizon. So break-even rent is fine, but it has to be truly break-even over a 40-year timeline, not just in the current operating year.
That's a good point. Probably got time for one more question here, and it was really around if you guys can comment on the roles of private philanthropy in the U.S., which hosts a large majority of the world's billionaires. Not all of them aligned for good purposes, but some of them.
Not all of them paying taxes.
Yeah. And Canada, where far fewer billionaires, I think, per capita, more distributed wealth.
Regardless, having said that, I mean, Peter Dreyer from Occidental did a very, formerly at the Boston Housing Authority, did a very good piece of research back in the late 1990s, looking at philanthropic support for affordable housing. And he found, I think it was something like 800 foundations endowed with more than 2 million each, or some big number at the time, and found that less than 1% of their granting was going into the affordable housing space. And the finding from that research was that because the philanthropic movement on the granting side, they want to have an impact. If you want to fund a kids' food program or a literacy program or something, $100,000 goes a long way. It builds a quarter of a housing unit. So it's very, very hard for a capital-intensive good like housing to compete for the philanthropic dollar. Where the other piece is, I think, is that we are seeing an increasing involvement and certainly increasing interest here in Canada in impact investing, where rather than actually taking the granting piece of the philanthropy, they're using their endowment, which instead of buying T-bills and getting 4%, 4.5% on 10-year bonds, they're actually investing at 4.5% into affordable housing projects. And we are seeing a growth of that now in the Canadian context. I don't know to the extent that's also happening in the US, but I think there's probably more potential for that than there is to get in on the granting side because of the incredibly large amounts you need for to help one household.
Yeah, and philanthropy is great. Social impact investment probably has more potential because it can bring more capital to the table. But this doesn't replace government capital. It just doesn't replace government investment. It can extend and it can stack on top of, but it's not an excuse for governments to get out of this space.
Yeah, that's a good point.
As advocates, we can't stop fighting.
Right on. You need a rallying flag, and you need 20 more years of tenacity there, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm in. Well, 15.
Now that you're the only
maybe
G7
3 more years
country,
might be enough.
now that you're the only G7 country without a national housing strategy, you can use that line to.
Yes, we'll give you that line. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, guys, I really appreciate your time. I know you had to prepare for this and take time from your day jobs. So thank you for the contribution. Look forward to seeing you again soon. And thanks everybody for participating today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I know.